Thank you, Alessio, for this time. Thank you very much. I wanted to have your opinion on a particular argument or chain of arguments that is made by this author, Nancy Fraser, which published a book that is called Cannibal Capitalism, a very, very critical book on capitalism. And from my understanding, it has the same aim that you do, but at the same time has the opposite opinion on the solution for the environmental problem and the way we should solve it. So basically, the argument of the author is that capitalism is inherently unable to cope with nature in a productive way. And the only relationship that will ever be possible between capitalism and nature is one of abuse. And the idea is to say that capitalism has the profit, the creation of capital as the only aim, and therefore it will always be cheaper to abuse nature, to steal from it, rather than to preserve it. And so I would like to know how your view might get back at this argument.
So as the premise is, I'm not aware of the book, even though you summarized it well, and it belongs, as you said, to a chain of arguments that is not necessarily new. I'm sure the author gives some new take to it, but it is a long-standing argument in the tradition of critiques of capitalism and its relationship with nature. When I hear these critiques, I sort of understand where they're coming from, because you look at the current situation, and there are indeed certain aspects that suggest that the current system is being unable to cope with nature restoration, climate change, and probably the environment. There are issues of externalities, which is a classic problem that gets mentioned in the fact that we're focusing on profits and a profit-driven system and prices to organize the system. But if nature is not priced, because it belongs in a certain way to everybody, then the system is unable to cope with nature. Where we depart is whether, I guess it's on two things. First is whether the system can be adjusted to take that into account. That is where, let's say, more mainstream economists would argue in favor of having carbon pricing, having things like this, so that you start reinserting the issues into a pricing system. And if you insert a pricing system, then you have the price mechanism should work, in principle, given us a sufficiently high price, which is a tax, effectively. So that is the first departing point. The second departing point, which is more meta perhaps, and therefore closer to your heart as a philosopher in the making, is that when I hear these critiques, I'm not entirely sure of how have we reached the conclusion that it is capitalism per se. And to a certain extent, where I struggle is that it gives, with a lot of, let's say, of this argument, but many more, is that they give a lot of agency to a system, which to my mind, I don't understand exactly what it means. So it feels like this is the Kraken monster that we've unleashed, as if the agents within it are completely victims of the system and there is no agency at all, which to my mind is a bit of a stretch, which comes to a certain extent also from a more, let's say, sociological reading also of capitalism, where humans, people, agents are just victims of the system. You don't have preferences of your own. It's the system that is engendering, making you believe you need certain things, but you don't have any preference of your own, and you don't have any feature of your own. Everything is sort of generated by the institution, which to my mind, I mean, there is some truth in that. Not that I don't recognize the importance of social status and so on. So there are certain features that do affect preferences, but it seems to me that this is bringing that type of argument to an extreme, which doesn't seem to hold to my mind. And when trying to reflect on these aspects, I try to think of what is the alternative that people have in mind when they try to link it to capitalism, which, we can disagree on the specific definitions and therefore as to when the system came into being. Usually we're thinking of something around the 1500s with the advent of banking and with the advent of the private firm, and therefore with the creation of a stronger private sector. Now, if you take the 1500s, give or take 1516, doesn't matter, some point before the Industrial Revolution, as the beginning of modern day capitalism, or how we intend it today, then it would seem that the destruction of nature should have started at that point.
Yeah.
And to my mind, it is not. And so, you could go as back as saying, well, the beginning, when we started doing agriculture was extremely destructive to nature. It was based on practices of slash and burn. So literally, you didn't have let's say technical knowledge as to how to improve fertilization of lands. So you would slash down forests, burn them, because you've burned them, then you can use the land for a few years until it doesn't go barren, and then you move on and you slash them something more, you burn it, and that is extremely destructive to nature. And this just to give you one example, and you could give many, that you could look at extraction, so like extraction of minerals, which was and coal as well, by the way, that was happening under the Roman Empire, and it was leading to extremely destructive local environmental harm, especially in Spain, that was harbor to some of these minerals that were important in those societies. So, this idea that there was, say, an idyllic past where we were perfectly in balance with nature, and then something happened in between. We sort of sold ourselves and our souls to the devil of capitalism, and now we're entrained into this system of destruction, is, to my mind, looking for a scapegoat. And so, because we're living in this complex system, and I suspect, or in my mind, we are, in a way, we have been contributing to the problem, but without wanting to recognize that, we're looking for an external enemy, as is frequently done. And in this case, it allows you to blame everything on capitalism, which is everything and nothing. And it allows you to distance yourself as having a responsibility. And to my mind, it also not necessarily contributes to the solution, in the sense that you're effectively landing in a space where you cannot do anything in order to try and reduce environmental impacts, trying to fight climate change, fight biodiversity loss, and so on. There is nothing you can do on that front unless you have abolished the system per se. And so it is effectively an all or nothing type of mentality or mindset you're entering into, where either there is a revolution tomorrow, or we are not contributing in any way.
It's never enough.
It's never enough. Which, to a certain extent, a never enough attitude I like, because that is how social progress also comes about, and technical progress comes about. You don't settle for what is, but rather you're looking for constant improvement. So the constant improvement part I like. What I dislike is that this type of mindset doesn't allow for experimentation, because nothing can be done at the margins. It is either everything or nothing. You cannot just say, okay, we try to, expand national parks to protect biodiversity loss at sea or on land. No, because you're not. It's the capitalism that is destructive, so you can't do that. It's not gonna help. We can't do a bit of carbon pricing because that's not going to help. You can't. So everything is either we have the revolution and we dismantle the system, or we don't. And perhaps the third line of argument, bringing it closer to modern days, is to try and look for alternative systems. And of course, the classic example that gets given is a Soviet Union type of organization, looking at societies that have tried to move away from capitalism and organize their society in a different way that does not rely on prices, that should not rely on profits, and therefore on that.
Eco-socialism, here's the term. We should go for an eco-socialist society, anti-capitalist, trans environmental. And
environmental, I don't know. Eco-socialist, I am aware, and it is one way or one school of thought within the degrowth type of mentality. And my struggle there is to say, look, other societies that have moved towards a more socialist organization of their system, of their economy, actually have a very poor track record on
Yeah.
environmental issues, whether it was environmental pollution, whether it was air pollution, whether it was mining, whether it was methane extraction, whether it was extracting water from lakes and therefore draining them completely. On all of these fronts, if at all, a Soviet Union type of system had a worse track record than parallel capitalistic societies at the same time. So it is not clear to me that just that switch alone is the key to solving the problem. And again, to my mind, the ultimate or the initial step that you need is more a shift in in people's preferences, in the sense of realizing, well, being aware that there is a problem, whether it is climate change, biodiversity, and so on, realizing that there is a problem and effectively making the next step to valuing a solution. And in the moment in which you attach value to the solution, then we can try to see how we make this happen. But if you don't see, let's say, protecting biodiversity as a priority and something that you're willing to pay for within a capitalistic system, or give up something in a quantity-based system, there's no way that we're going to move away from this reality.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That's a lot of arguments. Actually, you tracked pretty consistently the whole steps, the different steps that she undertakes. There is obviously the argument of the historical argument, and it's honestly one of the weakest one, because she says, okay, pre-capitalist societies had their fair share of situations where they abused of the environment, but that was only due to ignorance. And current other systems, for example, she says the really existing socialisms, they did have the fair share of abusing of the planet, but it was only because of the competition set by the capitalist society that led them to undertake these routes that diverted from the true meaning of socialism. Therefore, they all had an excuse, and capitalism alone is just evil. And the only objective, and not only, it's not an objective, it's like unnecessary conclusion, unnecessary development and degeneration of the system. It will always abuse nature, and there is no gap to grow for capitalism. It will always be abusive, and it's such problematic view, at least for me, because, as you said, it's all-inclusive solution. Every problem is due to capitalism, without having actually an argument to sustain it. And of course, the book goes into even the social problems, and pretty much every social problem seems to be caused by capitalism, which is another very problematic view, because historically you have the same argument. It's like saying, how about the fact that capitalism is pretty new, the fact that he can just have inherited this problem and it's acting out and trying to dismantle in them right now. But you don't have time to see, where we are going. And if you look at where we are going, we're going in a pretty good place. But anyway, a good argument that she does is an argument for technology. She says, yeah, capitalism is pretty inventive, and we could find technologies that help us for the environment. But the problem is that all these technologies will not have the aim of saving the planet, will only have the aim of making profit. And she does a few examples. One of the best ones is the whole discussion on GMOs. For example, the seeds, the fact that a lot of big, huge companies are creating seeds that could help with the climate crisis, but at the same time, since they want to make profit, they make them sterile, so that the farmers need to buy them every year and not be able to just harvest them and replant them. And this is an example of how technology could be a good tool, but under the capitalist society will always be only aimed at profit and never at something else. And so she says, why should we keep this system? Let's just scrap it. We use another system with the aim of saving the earth, and you will get the technology you need. You don't need to trust a market that has every incentive in abusing nature, because it will always be cheaper than saving it.
You know, I mean, on the innovation front, again, it's a long-term debate, effectively, which can be boiled down to whether cooperation or competition is the strongest lever towards innovation. And in a way, let's say, within a capitalistic type of mindset, what you're saying is, yeah, you're going to generate some waste first. And
Yeah.
second, yes, it is going to be directed towards private returns, but it is the private returns that generate the incentive. So we praise an incentive for innovation, but the incentive is the private return. And so that is why we're talking about the same thing. And so you're seeing the negative side of it, but while praising the positive sides of it, and you can't have them both. Alternative reading is to say, no, we're just going to join forces and we're going to do innovation as a group. And so you don't need Amazon competing with Google, competing with Microsoft for who creates the best AI. You just sit everybody in the room, and they're going to work together to create only one system that works amazingly. I mean, I guess it's a bit of an open debate, but a lot of work has gone into this. And again, you can look at it also historically. It seems that this is something that creates problems of its own. You're generating a single monopoly. You're typically giving it in the hands of governments that respond to their own incentives, which is not necessarily saving the planet. I mean, phrased in this way, it feels like government is the omniscient, benevolent dictator, which is not. I mean, I work in an institution. I'm sitting at the European Commission right now, so I'm not going to be negative about governments, but I see also their limits. And you suffer from a variety of misincentives or disincentives as well. And so there, I wouldn't celebrate necessarily the argument that you will do innovation in a mandated way. It seems that getting in incentives towards fostering innovation is right. Of course, you want to align them. So the risk, of course, and one of the arguments that gets raised the most against capitalism right now is that you look at the news and you see that that specific corporations are spending billions and billions on, I don't know, developing the metaverse, which makes you wonder, okay, does this have a future? But at the same time, we need a lot of investment on green technologies, on hydrogen, on solar, and so on. And so it makes you wonder, like, why are we letting them use so much resources in society into stuff that is dubious, rather than forcing them to do something else?
Yeah.
You can try to twist incentives. And so you can put in place a Inflation Reduction Act, as Biden did, as the administration in the US did, sort of giving incentives to firms to develop and deploy green technologies. And so again, you're working within the price mechanism, but trying to shift, reorient, and push companies still to compete, but to give them a strong reason to do so on the topics that we think are important. In terms then of the returns, ideally, so you want to keep the incentive structure, and what you would do, let's say, from an ideal point of view, is that you tax after. So you keep the incentives in place, you have your returns, you do the innovation, but then once you're done, you generate some profits. There are healthy profits, but part of that will be taxed and it returns into the global bucket, and then we can use it to do something else. And so that would be, let's say, the textbook type of answer within a capitalistic system.
So what do you think would be a comeback to the argument of it will always be cheaper to steal from nature, to abuse nature, rather than to protect it? Because one of the arguments that the author does is saying, even if you apply taxes, businesses will just offset in other countries the environmental harm. So we are doing it right now, like for harvesting rare materials like lithium for the the cell phones. We just offset them. We do it in developing countries. We abuse even workers, so there is even the human rights violations, and it is a huge problem for the environmental crisis. And so her argument is saying, how will you ever arrive to a point where for a company it will be profitable to be green?
I mean, yes, it has several points that are worth taking. Perhaps one that is particularly close to my heart is to realize that when I hear these arguments and they say, yeah, but we're substituting electric vehicles, but you still need minerals.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. I mean, everything we do, every activity we engage in has an impact on the planet. You walking to work has an impact on the planet. It has a reduced impact with respect to taking a car, but you will still be affecting nature, whatever you define that to be. So we are embedded within the ecosystem of planet or the Earth system, and our being here and doing things will always have an impact. So you have to start from the realization that we're not trying to cancel out completely our impact on the planet, because that is not possible. Only our canceling out of existence as humanity would be the way to completely, let's say, reduce this argument to zero and say, yeah, we're not having an impact anymore. So taking away, ideally, this scenario, which is not seen to me as suboptimal, but it requires recognizing some value in human life. So it is an anthropocentric view of value system, which I still think is valuable. Subject to that, you want to assess, what we're trying to do is that we want to reduce our impact, particularly on certain dimension. So we know that there are, I don't know, you can take the planetary boundaries type of framework, or you can focus on specific dimensions, say biodiversity, say climate change, say ocean acidification. You're identifying some challenges and you're trying to fix those problems. It could be that in fixing those problems, you're generating some other problems. Absolutely. But this is not a product of capitalism. This is a product of the advancements of technology, which again predate capitalism. So everything we do from the beginning, fire, you could say, but we started mastering fire 30,000 years ago, and that must have generated problems because you were chopping down forests, and probably fire was escaping out of control, and so you were also burning down some parts of the planet that you didn't want to do. And then you try to address those issues, and progressively it's sort of part of experiential learning. So you address problems as they come, and in doing that, probably you will generate some problems that we're not even aware of right now, and you will continue like this. So again, looking for the final solution to all issues at one, to my mind, is ahistorical and unrealistic. And then, of course, blaming, it has to be a general problem that addresses, to find a general solution to everything. And so it has to be the system, which to my mind wouldn't hold. In terms of that it's not possible to do so with technology or with capitalism, because inevitably you will just move problems elsewhere. Well, I don't know. I mean, there are other issues that we have solved without moving them elsewhere. If you think even on the environmental dimension, so a classic example being the ozone layer and problems related to the ozone layer, and the fact that it's not like we continue having fridges that use the CFC gas and chemicals, and we just have them made in Africa and shipped back. No, we found alternative technologies that do the same thing, and they actually are so effective that progressively they are spreading throughout the globe, and so they are being adopted elsewhere as well, and we're sort of getting rid of that problem. And you can look at that across a variety of lenses. So not necessarily always export the problem. On climate change specifically, we are aware of that problem, and so you also, again, try to think through incentives, and you say, okay, we will use carbon border taxes, so that if you just shift production somewhere else, but you want to sell your goods in Europe, you will be taxed as if you were producing it here. So it doesn't, we are canceling that incentive for you as a firm to just relocate in Turkey and then produce using coal or using polluting techniques and then re-importing it back into Europe. So again, I think that you have to think through incentives, and incentives are not a product of capitalism. You have these pictures, which I love, from medieval times, and you know how they were doing taxes and they were trying to be inventive with taxes. And so they would say, I don't know, a house is taxed based on the amounts of windows it has. And you start seeing that they started tearing down windows or bricking them, putting bricks on the walls. They would decide that a house was taxed based on the surface of the ground floor. And so you see these medieval houses that are built like a cone.
Yeah.
You're trying to minimize the land use at the ground floor because you want to minimize taxes. So this is just to say that people respond to incentives. This is not because of capitalism. This is not because we are focused on profits and money and dirty money. Just because you respond to incentives. And so whatever you do, whichever system you're in, you have to factor in incentives, and there's no way out of that. And so when deciding policy, you have to think that through, and thinking that just if we abolished capitalism, people unshackled would become this sort of utopian amorph being that behaves in the way you would like them to, is to my mind Panglossian, and so it's not going to lead us very, very far.
Yeah, thank you very much. Do you have some time for a last question, or you need to go?
Fire away.
Okay.
You need to go. You have a class.
Yeah, yeah, but this is such interesting conversation, and I really would like to just stay here. So last question would be, clearly by your ideas and according to your book, you have a fairly optimistic view on the way that capitalism could solve the environmental problem. My question would be, is that a reasonable solution, or is that the best solution? Like, are we just saying it is quite hard to change the system, therefore we just should work with what we have? Or do you believe that potentially this could be the best course of action, regardless of what system we have now?
So I was it's a very good question that denotes your intelligence. You had to prove it beyond this point. And I will reply with an anecdote, which is that a month and a half ago, just shortly before Christmas, 2 months ago, I was at a debate at Banque de France, so in Paris, and it was me and Tim Jackson. Jackson is one of the degrowth scholars of the original cohort, let's say, and we were having this debate, and evidently, let's say, I was presented as the optimist one, and he was initially presented as the pessimist, saying, you see, technology is not happening fast enough, and we're not making progress fast enough, and so on. So on the surface of it, it looks like I am the optimistic voice, and he is the pessimist, and he's the pessimist.
Mm-hmm.
After the event, we were having the refreshment, and the director of Banque de France came to me after we had these various exchanges of views with Tim Jackson. And he said, I've been reflecting on your presentation and your view of things. And it seems to me that actually we should turn this around. And that to a certain extent, you are the pessimist, and Tim Jackson, or let's say a degrowth type of mindset, is the optimistic one. In the fact that, and he called me even this, which is, he said, to a certain extent, you are a Machiavelli of climate policy. And he even said, I hope you don't take it negatively, but I'm going to say this thing. And I was like, what do you mean? And he's like, well, to a certain extent, what you're saying is we are taking, let's say, some human features that you recognize as persistent, and we're having to work with them. And so to a certain extent, you're pessimistic insofar as there will be some negative impacts, but there's nothing we can do about that. We're trying to do the best we can within, let's say, the constraints of the system. Whereas the alternative reading is, I would define it utopian, but you can give also more positive terms and say, well, it is more hopeful. And so it is saying, no, people, once they have information, as you were saying, once they will know that these are the issues, they will change. They will change their ways. There will be scope for moral improvement, which is something that, again, is a recurrent theme throughout the history of economic thought or philosophical thinking broadly. And to my mind, this is not going anywhere. And so in that respect, I'm a pessimist because I don't believe that there will be this sort of moral awakening where people will shed old ways, give up old ways of doing things, and take a responsible approach, perhaps a more communitarian view of how we should deal with these problems, see our common humanity, and so try to act on climate change as a group rather than as nations or as smaller sub-entities. And so in that, I am relatively pessimistic. But let's say to define it in more neutral terms, and linking it back to your question, I wouldn't define myself as optimistic. When I wrote the book, it's not like I sat at the table and I was like, finally, there are so many negative books about climate change. I'm going to be the only one that writes a positive, optimistic take on this. This is not how the genesis of the book came about. But rather, I was just reflecting on these topics. And my impression is that I wouldn't consider myself an optimist. I realized that people were seeing me optimistic when reviews started to come in. And so when people were commenting about my book, like half of the reviews say like, Terzi's optimistic take on optimism on climate change. I wouldn't see it that way. Also because if you read the fine print of what I'm describing as the future ahead, it is not that utopian, at least not for all. So what I'm saying is, look, some degree of climate change is happening already. And so it's sort of baked into the system, which means we're going to see a world that becomes increasingly hostile as an environment. We are going to see an increased number of droughts, of floods, of extreme weather events. All I'm saying is that our best bet, as you were hinting at correctly, is to try and double down on the only thing that is a bit our superpower, which is using technology innovation, which can be also social innovation. So again, it is not a technocratic approach where we have to use technology only. You can also restructure some elements of society or the way the society is organized in response to an issue. But we will have to deal with this problem. And some countries will not manage to deal with this problem because it requires resources, and some of them don't have them, and some of them will just be stuck in old ways, either because they don't have resources or they take a conservative approach. So they just look back rather than look forward. They think that they can continue the old way, the safeguard the status quo, and so they will be stuck in the past and exposed to climate change more broadly. For the decades to come. So I'm not necessarily saying the future is amazing. I'm just saying the best way we have, the best course of action to make the future less grim is for us to stick to our guns, try to organize society along these incentives I'm describing, and in this, capitalism can be an ally.
That's such a great argument. I now understand how a lot of people misread your book, and I am guilty of that too, because your claim isn't to say, well, we should just manage what we have in the terms of a system, but we should manage what we have in terms of human nature. And capitalism is the best one in being able to actually use the human search for incentives and steer it in the right direction. And that's fantastic. That's a beautiful argument. And actually, at this point, I don't even know if this discussion about optimism or pessimism is relevant. It's about realism. What is the human nature that we need to deal with? And yeah, you really changed my mind. Thank you very much.
Good. I'm glad this was of use. What class is this that you're taking?
This is philosophy of politics, political philosophy. The course is straight up looking at different anti-capitalist authors. So I purposefully chose it because I like to challenge myself and see courses I disagree with. So I'm seeking for that other view. And
You have a sadic element to your choice
not
of.
static, it's more research based. It's like the person that holds an opinion you don't share will have more information from you for you rather than somebody that holds your same view. Will show you what you don't know and even what you didn't know you had to know. It's very productive. And
I try to do it myself. I have to say sometimes I have to take a deep breath because it's painful why you undergo it at times, but I agree. I try to
it's worth it.
expose myself.
It's totally worth it. Thank you very much. This has been extremely helpful for me.
Best of luck.
Thank you.
Come back to us when you're done
Yeah.
with the stronger powers of philosophy Jedi.
Thank you. And if I manage to do a good presentation and the professor responds good to it, I might try to do a whole paper for the exam. Could I get back to you after I read your book in its entirety and maybe do a little more questions, because I know that 30 minutes is not nearly enough to cover all your ideas, and I think they are very variable.
Yeah, get back to me, and
Okay.
we'll try to schedule something.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Alessio.
Ciao, buon weekend.
Grazie, anche a te.